In September 1952, a maintenance worker at Lincoln Elementary School in Riverside, California, made a discovery that would remain classified for 37 years. Behind a false wall in the school's basement, investigators found rows of filing cabinets containing detailed psychological profiles of over 300 children, complete with photographs, behavioral modification charts, and something called compliance ratings. What they uncovered in those sealed records would challenge everything we thought we knew about public education in post-war America. Hidden in classified government files until 1989, this is the story of innocent children who became unwitting subjects in a vast social engineering experiment, and the respected educators who transformed their classrooms into psychological laboratories. The mastermind behind this operation was Dr. Helen Walsh, a seemingly progressive superintendent with impeccable credentials from Columbia Teachers College. Under the guise of modern educational methods, she would implement a systematic program designed to test the limits of childhood conditioning and behavioral control. Before we dive into this disturbing case, make sure you're subscribed to Fear Classified. We uncover these forgotten horrors every week, and this channel isn't for everyone. Only for those brave enough to learn what really happened when America's schools became testing grounds for the human mind. What began as an innovative approach to education would evolve into something far more sinister, a coordinated effort to determine just how completely a child's thoughts, behaviors, and very identity could be reshaped through carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation. The year 1952 found suburban California in the midst of unprecedented growth and optimism. The post-war boom had transformed sleepy agricultural communities into sprawling developments filled with young families seeking the American dream. Riverside, located 60 miles east of Los Angeles, exemplified this transformation. Its population had tripled since 1940, creating an urgent need for new schools and educational infrastructure. The Cold War cast a long shadow over American society, generating fears about communist infiltration and the need to produce citizens capable of resisting foreign psychological warfare. Government agencies, particularly the newly formed CIA, were actively researching mind control techniques, often funding university programs and medical facilities to study behavioral modification and social conditioning. It was within this climate of expansion and anxiety that the Riverside School District embarked on what appeared to be a progressive educational initiative. The district had received substantial federal funding through the National Education Enhancement Act, a little-known program that provided grants to schools willing to pilot advanced pedagogical methods developed in collaboration with university psychology departments. At the center of this story stands Dr. Helen Walsh, a 42-year-old educational psychologist whose credentials were impeccable. She held advanced degrees from Columbia Teachers College, and the University of Chicago had published numerous papers on childhood development and had served as a consultant to the Department of Education. Her appointment as superintendent of the rapidly growing Riverside District was heralded by local newspapers as a coup for progressive education. What residents didn't know was that Dr. Walsh had spent 2 years working as a civilian consultant for classified government programs studying group psychology and behavioral conditioning. Her academic work had caught the attention of researchers investigating methods for identifying and neutralizing potential security threats within American society, including the possibility of foreign agents using children as unwitting intelligence assets. The Riverside School District seemed like the perfect laboratory for these theories. The community was largely middle-class and homogeneous, the families were stable and trusting of authority, and the rapid growth meant that unusual procedures could be implemented without raising suspicions among established families who might question changes to traditional methods. Dr. Walsh's first initiative was the implementation of what she called comprehensive student development profiles. Parents were told these assessments would help teachers better understand each child's learning style and potential. What they weren't told was that these profiles were designed to identify children who might be susceptible to various forms of psychological influence, or conversely, those who showed signs of resistance to authority that might require special attention. On October the 15th, 1952, 7-year-old Michael Patterson experienced something that would haunt him for the rest of his life, though he wouldn't understand what had happened until decades later. Michael was a bright, curious child who had started second grade at Lincoln Elementary just 6 weeks earlier. His teacher, Mrs. Dorothy Crane, had identified him as what she termed a high-potential subject for the district's special programs. According to records discovered in the basement archives, Michael had been selected for what Dr. Walsh called enhanced learning protocols. These sessions, conducted twice weekly during regular school hours, were presented to parents as advanced tutoring for gifted students. Michael's mother, Margaret Patterson, was thrilled that her son had been chosen for such special attention. The sessions took place in a windowless room in the school's basement, furnished with child-sized desks, educational posters, and what appeared to be standard learning materials, but hidden behind false panels were observation windows, recording equipment, and detailed charts tracking each child's responses to various stimuli and scenarios. Medical records indicate that Dr. Walsh had developed a systematic approach to testing childhood, suggestibility, and compliance. Children were presented with increasingly unusual requests disguised as educational exercises or games. These ranged from simple tasks like arranging colored blocks in specific patterns to more complex scenarios involving role-playing exercises where children were asked to imagine themselves in various adult situations. What made these sessions particularly insidious was their gradual progression. Initial activities seemed perfectly normal: memory games, puzzle-solving, creative storytelling. But over time, the exercises became more psychologically invasive. Children were asked to describe their family's private conversations, to imagine scenarios where they might need to keep secrets from their parents, and to participate in what were called loyalty tests, where they had to choose between conflicting instructions from different authority figures. Michael later described to investigators how these sessions gradually became more uncomfortable. He remembered being asked to draw pictures of his family, then being questioned in detail about why he had depicted his father in a particular way or why his mother looked sad in the drawing. When he expressed confusion or reluctance to answer certain questions, he was told that smart children always cooperated with their teachers. The psychological manipulation extended beyond the basement sessions. Teachers began implementing what Dr. Walsh termed environmental conditioning in regular classrooms. This involved subtle changes to daily routines, the introduction of seemingly arbitrary rules that children had to follow without explanation, and the systematic rewarding of compliance while subtly punishing independent thinking or questioning of authority. Children who adapted well to these conditions were praised and given special privileges. Those who showed resistance or asked too many questions found themselves facing increased scrutiny, being held after school for additional support, or being moved to different classrooms where the conditioning techniques could be intensified. But this was only the beginning of a pattern that would eventually claim over 300 victims across 5 different schools in the district. As the 1952-53 school year progressed, Dr. Walsh's program expanded systematically across the district. What had begun as experimental sessions with a small group of children at Lincoln Elementary evolved into a comprehensive network of psychological testing that eventually encompassed students from kindergarten through 6th grade at 5 different schools. The operation's scope became apparent through documents discovered during the 1989 investigation. Dr. Walsh had established what she called research coordination centers in each participating school, typically converted storage rooms or unused offices that were renovated to include observation facilities, recording equipment, and specialized furniture designed to create controlled psychological environments. Each center was staffed by specially trained personnel who had undergone intensive workshops, conducted by Dr. Walsh herself, often in collaboration with visiting experts whose credentials were listed in the files but whose actual identities remained classified even in the declassified documents. These staff members were instructed to present themselves as reading specialists, guidance counselors, or educational assistants to avoid arousing suspicion among parents and regular teaching staff. Investigation records show that the program operated on multiple levels simultaneously. While some children participated in the intensive basement sessions, others were subjects of classroom-based experiments that tested their responses to various forms of social pressure, authority manipulation, and group dynamics. Teachers were given specific scripts for introducing unusual rules or activities, then required to document each child's compliance level and emotional responses. The most disturbing aspect of the program was its systematic approach to identifying and exploiting individual psychological vulnerabilities. Children who showed signs of anxiety were subjected to scenarios designed to heighten their fears, then observed to see how this affected their willingness to follow instructions. Those who demonstrated strong attachments to family members were presented with exercises that gradually introduced the concept of divided loyalties or competing authority figures. Dr. Walsh's files contained detailed personality profiles for each participating child, complete with assessments of their manipulation potential, resistance thresholds, and optimal conditioning approaches. These profiles were continuously updated based on the children's responses to various tests and scenarios, creating comprehensive psychological maps that tracked how each child's behavior and thinking patterns could be modified over time. Parents began noticing changes in their children's behavior, though initially these seemed like positive developments. Many children became more obedient at home, less likely to question parental decisions, and more focused on pleasing authority figures. Teachers reported improved classroom discipline and higher levels of compliance with school rules and procedures. However, some parents and teachers began to express concerns about more troubling changes. Several children developed what appeared to be anxiety disorders, becoming excessively worried about making mistakes or disappointing adults. Others showed signs of emotional withdrawal, becoming less spontaneous and creative in their play and interactions with peers. Mrs. Eleanor Bradley, a fourth-grade teacher at Roosevelt Elementary, later told investigators that she had become increasingly uncomfortable with the changes she observed in her students. Children who had previously been imaginative and independent thinkers seemed to be losing their natural curiosity, instead focusing obsessively on determining what answers their teachers wanted to hear. The program's influence extended beyond individual children to encompass entire peer groups and classroom dynamics. Dr. Walsh had developed techniques for using social pressure and group psychology to reinforce the conditioning effects. Children were divided into study teams, where those who had adapted to the program's expectations were paired with those showing resistance, creating situations where peer pressure could be used to encourage conformity. These teams participated in exercises designed to test group loyalty versus individual conscience. Children were presented with scenarios where they had to choose between following rules and helping a friend, or between telling the truth and protecting the group from consequences. Their responses were carefully documented and used to refine the program's understanding of how childhood moral development could be influenced and redirected. What appeared to be innovative educational methods was actually a sophisticated system for studying and manipulating the fundamental psychological processes that shape childhood development, identity, formation, and moral reasoning. By the spring of 1953, Dr. Walsh's operation had evolved far beyond its original scope. What had begun as educational research had transformed into something resembling a comprehensive social engineering experiment that now involved nearly every aspect of participating children's school experience. Classified documents reveal that Dr. Walsh had established contact with researchers at major universities who were conducting similar work under government contracts. These collaborations allowed her to implement increasingly sophisticated techniques developed through studies of prisoner behavior, military training psychology, and what were euphemistically termed enhanced interrogation methods. The program began incorporating what Dr. Walsh called stress inoculation protocols designed to test children's responses to various forms of psychological pressure. These involved creating artificial crisis situations within the school environment, such as false emergency drills, simulated authority conflicts, or scenarios where children had to make difficult choices under time pressure, while carefully observing and documenting their reactions. One particularly disturbing aspect of this phase involved the systematic manipulation of family relationships. Children were gradually encouraged to view their teachers and school administrators as more reliable sources of information and guidance than their parents. This was accomplished through subtle techniques such as suggesting that parents didn't understand modern educational methods, implying that family values were outdated, or creating situations where children felt they had to choose between school expectations and family traditions. The program's files contained detailed analyses of each family's social and political beliefs, religious practices, and cultural backgrounds. This information was used to design scenarios that would test children's loyalty to family values versus school authority. Children from conservative families were presented with progressive viewpoints and asked to defend or critique their family's positions. Those from liberal backgrounds faced similar challenges from the opposite direction. Medical records indicate that some children began experiencing significant psychological distress as a result of these conflicting pressures. Several developed what would now be recognized as symptoms of anxiety disorders, depression, and what psychologists term moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when individuals are forced to act against their fundamental beliefs and values. Dr. Walsh documented these effects but viewed them as valuable data rather than signs that the program was causing harm. Her reports to funding agencies described these psychological symptoms as evidence that the conditioning techniques were successfully challenging existing belief structures and creating opportunities for cognitive restructuring. The most alarming development was the introduction of what Dr. Walsh termed deep conditioning protocols for children who showed particular aptitude for the program, or conversely those who demonstrated strong resistance to standard techniques. These intensive sessions, conducted individually rather than in groups, involved more extreme forms of psychological manipulation designed to produce profound changes in personality and behavior. Files suggest that these sessions included techniques such as sensory deprivation, prolonged isolation, repetitive questioning designed to create confusion and doubt, and the systematic undermining of children's confidence in their own perceptions and memories. Children were told that their memories of family life were unreliable, that their emotional responses were inappropriate, and that their previous beliefs and values were childish misconceptions that needed to be corrected. The program had also begun experimenting with pharmaceutical interventions. Several children were given medications disguised as vitamins or treatments for minor health issues. These substances, according to medical records, were designed to increase suggestibility, reduce anxiety, resistance to authority, or enhance memory formation during conditioning sessions. Parents who began asking questions about their children's changed behavior were told that these were normal developmental phases or positive signs of increased maturity and social awareness. Those who persisted in expressing concerns found themselves facing suggestions that they might be suffering from overprotectiveness or resistance to their children's educational progress. What had started as an educational experiment had evolved into a comprehensive program for systematically undermining children's psychological autonomy and reshaping their fundamental relationship with authority, family, and their own sense of reality. The breakthrough that would finally expose the true scope of Dr. Walsh's operation came from an unexpected source. On May 18, 1953, 8-year-old Susan Morrison suffered what appeared to be a severe psychological breakdown during one of the intensive conditioning sessions. According to emergency medical records, she was found in a catatonic state, unable to speak or respond to any external stimuli. Susan was immediately transported to Riverside General Hospital, where she remained in a dissociative state for 3 days. When she finally began to respond to treatment, she started revealing details about the program that would eventually lead to its exposure. Her accounts were initially dismissed by medical staff as trauma-induced fantasies, but the specificity and consistency of her descriptions eventually prompted a more serious investigation. Dr. James Morrison, Susan's father and a clinical psychologist himself, began his own investigation when hospital records failed to adequately explain his daughter's condition. His professional background allowed him to recognize signs of systematic psychological trauma that seemed inconsistent with any legitimate educational program. Working quietly to avoid alerting school officials, Dr. Morrison began interviewing other parents whose children had participated in the special programs. What he discovered was a pattern of psychological symptoms that suggested coordinated and systematic manipulation rather than isolated incidents or normal childhood developmental issues. His investigation revealed that dozens of children were exhibiting signs of what would now be recognized as complex trauma, including dissociation, anxiety disorders, sleep disturbances, and what he termed artificial compliance syndrome, a condition where children had lost their natural ability to form independent judgments and instead defaulted to seeking external validation for all decisions. Dr. Morrison's clinical notes, preserved in the investigation files, documented his growing horror as he began to understand the scope of what had been done to these children. His interviews revealed that many students had been subjected to techniques that were clearly designed to break down normal psychological defenses and create artificial dependencies on authority figures. The breakthrough came when Dr. Morrison managed to gain access to Susan's medical records from her sessions with the school. These documents, which Dr. Walsh had apparently assumed would never be examined by qualified professionals, contained detailed descriptions of psychological manipulation, techniques that were clearly inappropriate for use with children under any circumstances. Armed with this evidence, Dr. Morrison contacted federal authorities, specifically the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, which had been investigating concerns about communist infiltration in American institutions. While his initial suspicions about foreign influence proved unfounded, the investigation revealed something potentially more disturbing: a domestic program that had used American children as subjects for psychological warfare research. The FBI investigation, conducted over several months in 1953 and 1954, uncovered the full scope of Dr. Walsh's operation. Agents discovered the basement facilities at all 5 schools, along with thousands of pages of documentation detailing the systematic psychological manipulation of over 300 children over a 2-year period. Investigation records show that Dr. Walsh had been receiving funding through a complex network of government grants and university research contracts, much of it ultimately traced to classified programs, studying psychological warfare techniques and population control methods. Her work was part of a broader initiative to understand how civilian populations, particularly children, might be protected from or rendered resistant to foreign psychological manipulation. However, the investigation revealed that the program had evolved far beyond its original defensive purposes. Dr. Walsh had begun testing techniques for actively reshaping children's political beliefs, social attitudes, and fundamental personality characteristics. Her files contained proposals for expanding the program to encompass entire school systems and ultimately influence the political and social development of an entire generation. The most disturbing discovery was evidence that Dr. Walsh had been in contact with researchers conducting similar experiments at other locations across the country. Documents suggested that the Riverside program was part of a broader network of facilities testing various approaches to childhood psychological conditioning, with results being shared among researchers and government agencies. The truth was more horrifying than anyone had imagined. What had appeared to be a progressive educational initiative was actually a systematic study of how completely a child's mind could be reshaped through coordinated psychological manipulation conducted on American children by their own government and educational system. When federal authorities finally intervened in late 1953, they faced a crisis that extended far beyond the Riverside School District. The investigation had revealed connections to similar programs at dozens of other locations involving thousands of children and hundreds of researchers, teachers, and administrators who had participated in what amounted to unauthorized human experimentation on a massive scale. The government's response was swift and comprehensive, but focused more on containing the scandal than on providing justice for the victims. Dr. Walsh was quietly removed from her position and relocated to a research facility where her work could continue under more controlled circumstances. Most of the other personnel involved in the program were reassigned to different positions or encouraged to seek employment outside the education system. The children and families affected by the program received no official acknowledgement that anything inappropriate had occurred. Parents who had discovered evidence of the psychological manipulation were approached by government representatives who explained that discussing the matter publicly would damage national security interests and potentially expose their children to further trauma through media attention. Declassified documents reveal that a comprehensive effort was undertaken to remove all traces of the program from school records, medical files, and government archives. The basement facilities were quickly renovated to eliminate any evidence of their previous use. Equipment was removed or destroyed, and the specialized staff members who had conducted the conditioning sessions were reassigned to other projects or encouraged to sign confidentiality agreements that prevented them from discussing their involvement. The official investigation concluded that while the program had used unconventional methods, it had been conducted within legal parameters and had not caused any lasting harm to participating children. This conclusion was reached despite extensive evidence of psychological trauma documented by Dr. Morrison and other independent investigators. Many of the affected children continued to experience long-term psychological effects that would persist into adulthood. Medical records from the following decades show patterns of anxiety disorders, difficulty forming independent judgments, problems with authority relationships, and what several psychologists identified as symptoms consistent with institutional trauma. Susan Morrison, whose breakdown had initially exposed the program, required several years of intensive therapy to recover her ability to function independently. Her father's clinical notes document a gradual process of helping her distinguish between her authentic thoughts and feelings and the artificial responses that had been conditioned through the school program. Other children experienced similar struggles. Many reported feeling disconnected from their own emotions and uncertain about their genuine beliefs and preferences. Some developed what Dr. Morrison termed authority anxiety, an excessive need to seek approval from external sources for even minor decisions. Others swung in the opposite direction, developing deep mistrust of all institutions and authority figures. The long-term impact on families was equally devastating. Many parents reported feeling betrayed by institutions they had trusted with their children's education and development. Some families moved away from Riverside entirely, seeking to escape the memories and associations with the program. Others remained but found themselves unable to trust local schools, medical professionals, or government services. Investigation records show that Dr. Walsh continued her research for several more years, working with various government agencies on projects that remained classified well into the 1980s. Her work at Riverside was eventually incorporated into broader studies of population psychology and social control, methods contributing to programs that would later influence military training, prisoner rehabilitation, and what were euphemistically termed enhanced interrogation techniques. The Riverside case was officially sealed in 1954, with all records classified under national security provisions. Families who attempted to pursue legal action found themselves facing government lawyers who argued that exposing details of the program would compromise ongoing security operations and potentially endanger other children who had participated in similar research projects. For 35 years, the full extent of what had happened in Riverside remained hidden from public view. The children who had been subjected to Dr. Walsh's experiments grew into adults carrying psychological scars that they couldn't fully understand or explain. Many struggled with relationships, careers, and their own sense of identity, never knowing that their difficulties stemmed from systematic psychological manipulation they had experienced as children. The Riverside School District case was finally declassified in 1989 as part of broader government efforts to acknowledge past ethical violations in medical and psychological research. However, many questions remain unanswered, and the full scope of similar programs across the country has never been completely revealed. When the documents were finally released, they confirmed what Dr. Morrison and other investigators had suspected, that Riverside was not an isolated incident but part of a broader network of research facilities testing various approaches to psychological conditioning and social control. References in the files point to similar programs in at least 12 other states, though many of these cases remain classified or have had their records destroyed. The revelation of the Riverside program sparked renewed interest in other controversial research projects from the same era, including studies of LSD's effects on unwitting subjects, sensory deprivation, experiments, and various attempts to develop techniques for modifying personality and behavior. The common thread connecting these programs was the use of vulnerable populations, children, psychiatric patients, prisoners, and military personnel, as subjects for research that would have been considered unethical if conducted with informed consent. Many of the adults who had been subjected to Dr. Walsh's program as children came forward when the files were declassified, seeking answers about their experiences and the long-term effects they had suffered. Their accounts provided additional details about the program's methods and impact, painting a picture of systematic psychological abuse disguised as educational innovation. Several class action lawsuits were filed against the government agencies that had funded the research, though most were settled out of court with confidentiality provisions that had prevented full disclosure of the evidence. The settlement amounts were relatively modest, and many victims felt that justice had not been served, particularly given that most of the individuals directly responsible for the program had died or were too elderly to face meaningful consequences. Dr. Walsh herself passed away in 1987, 2 years before the documents were declassified. Her personal papers, donated to a university archive, contained additional evidence of the program's scope and methods, including correspondence with researchers at other facilities and proposals for even more extensive experiments that were never implemented. The psychological techniques developed through programs like the one at Riverside have continued to influence various fields, from marketing and advertising to military training and interrogation methods. Many of the conditioning approaches tested on children in the 1950s have been refined and adapted for use in corporate training programs, political campaigns, and what are now called influence operations in the digital age. Current educational practices still raise questions about the appropriate boundaries between instruction and psychological manipulation. The use of behavioral modification techniques in schools, the collection of detailed psychological data on students, and the implementation of programs designed to influence children's social and political attitudes all echo concerns raised by the Riverside case. Some researchers argue that similar programs may be continuing today under different guises, using more sophisticated techniques and legal protections that make detection and exposure more difficult. The rise of digital technology has created new opportunities for monitoring and influencing childhood development that would have been impossible in Dr. Walsh's era. The Riverside case serves as a reminder of how easily the boundary between education and manipulation can be crossed, particularly when authority figures have access to detailed psychological information about vulnerable subjects and when their activities are shielded from public scrutiny by claims of institutional necessity or national security. What happened to those 300 children in Riverside represents one of the darkest chapters in American educational history, a systematic betrayal of trust that used childhood innocence as raw material for psychological experimentation. The effects of that betrayal continue to reverberate through the lives of the survivors and their families, serving as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of protecting children's psychological autonomy. The sealed basement rooms where it all began have long since been converted to normal storage space, but the questions raised by what happened there remain as relevant today as they were 70 years ago. In an era of increasing concern about institutional manipulation and the protection of individual psychological freedom, the Riverside case reminds us that the most dangerous threats to human dignity often come disguised as progress and innovation. What do you think really happened to the missing records from the other 11 programs mentioned in Dr. Walsh's files? The government has never confirmed or denied their existence, leaving open the possibility that similar experiments continued long after Riverside was shut down. Let us know in the comments what you think about the ethical boundaries of educational research and whether you believe adequate protections exist today to prevent similar abuses. And if this story gave you chills, you need to see what we uncovered about the psychiatric facility that tested mind control drugs on children. That investigation revealed connections to government programs that make the Riverside case look like just the beginning of something much larger and more disturbing. The children of Riverside deserved better. They deserved an education that nurtured their minds rather than reshaping them, teachers who respected their autonomy rather than exploiting their trust, and a society that protected their innocence rather than using it as experimental material. Their story serves as a stark reminder that the price of freedom includes eternal vigilance against those who would manipulate and control us, especially when they come bearing gifts of progress and claiming to act in our best interests. Sometimes the greatest threats to human dignity hide behind the most respectable facades, and the most innocent among us pay the highest price for our failure to question authority when questioning is most needed. Don't forget to subscribe to Fear Classified if you want to continue uncovering these hidden horrors from our past. Hit that notification bell because these stories of institutional betrayal and forgotten victims need to be told, remembered, and learned from. The truth about what happened in places like Riverside must never be allowed to disappear again into classified files and sealed basements. History's darkest secrets have a way of repeating themselves when we forget to remain vigilant. The children of Riverside can't tell their story anymore, but their legacy serves as a warning we cannot afford to ignore.